So welcome to our fourth session on the Sermon on the Mount, the attitudes of being based on the 8 statements known as the Beattitudes. It's first, Matthew 5, 3 through 10. There's 8 statements. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. That's the third one. And blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Those are the 2 we've already covered. And then also looking at the rest of the Sermon on the Mount as they relate to the Beatitudes. The Beatitudes form sort of a table of contents, if you will, for the rest of the sermon, except for it's in a reverse order. And so on the back of our sheet here, it kind of has the the order. We're going to do 12 sessions all the way through, and this is the 4th session, and we're talking about blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. A little bit of a background. These, as I mentioned, the first one is the blessed are the poor in spirit, and one of the things we want to think about is who he's talking to. Jesus was, they called it the Sermon on the Mount. In Luke, it's called the Sermon on the Plain, and it only gives a few of the statements and sounds a little different. Mark and John don't really go into it. They have some similar statements along the way, but Matthew is the most complete statement. And the Sermon on the Mount, whether it was a prepared sermon or somebody was taking notes while he was talking, we're not exactly sure. One of the things I believe is that the Apostle Matthew was chosen in part because he was a tax collector, and tax collectors had to read and write. So I think he probably said to Matthew, to take notes, and so Matthew would take notes, and together they created the sermon, or he at least documented what Jesus was saying, and that forms the core of the Gospel of Matthew. That it's his central thesis. It's basically all the teachings of Jesus kind of combined into one package, and that the Beatitudes create the central thesis, or a table of contents. And so if we understand the Beatitudes, then we can understand what Jesus taught. That's one thing that in Unity we like to look at. What did Jesus really teach? And what's the metaphysical meaning? And in Unity we talk about metaphysics being that which is above or beyond the physical. And in Unity thinking, we think in terms of our own soul unfoldment, our own soul growth. So that the Bible is not only history, his story, is not only the story of the people, what we would normally think of as history, although it's Eastern version of history and not Western version of history, that's a whole other story. And it's not just a system of moral teachings like the 10 Commandments and the Great Commandment and et cetera, but it's also our story. It's the mystery of the Bible that is our story. It's the story of our soul unfoldments. We look at ourselves from Adam and Eve as representing that awakening in consciousness, awakening to ourselves as individual beings. They realized they were naked, all the way through the book of Revelation, where we have a conscious recognition of the presence and the power of God. So we're unconscious of the presence and the power of God. We're unconscious of God's presence. We're living in an unconscious, and then that we have to step out of that in order to go through what we have to go through to get to the point where we are consciously living in the presence of God. And that's what heaven is. Heaven is the presence of God. And so we're learning to live in that presence. In the first Beatitude, he talks about, he says, blessed are the poor in spirit, which is not spiritually poor, but poor in pride, if you will, or being humble. It's not thinking that we have the right answers. We all have our own opinions and beliefs and experiences, and someone who has different opinions and beliefs and experiences is just as valid as ours. That there's a greater reality, and to be humble to that fact. And he's talking to the people who thought they were the chosen people. They were pulled out of Egypt. They were the chosen ones, and so they had a great deal of spiritual pride. They thought, and the Samaritans, the story of the Good Samaritan, the part we miss, is the priest and the Levite, who are these spiritual and religious leaders, pass by and they don't do the right thing. But then it's the Samaritan, who was a mixed race. He was from the northern kingdom, and it was a mix between, they practiced the Jewish religion, but they were not purebred Jewish, and they were looked down upon by the Judeans, the ones that we call the Jews from the southern kingdom. And so they were looked down upon. They were thought to be lesser people. Yet Jesus is saying this lesser person is the one that did the right thing, not the religious and political leaders, not the ones that we would normally think of would do the right thing. So the Samaritan was the good neighbor. So it's he's very much saying yes, we have to look again and realize and be humble in our own selves, and that blessed are the poor in spirit, for they shall experience theirs is the kingdom of God. And so that's the kingdom of God is recognizing the presence of God, being consciously in the presence of God. So when we exalt ourselves, we'll be humbled, and the humbled shall be exalted. That's another way of looking at it. Then we have, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. So as we give up our precious beliefs and ideas, as we give up our having to be right, then what happens? Well, we go through a stage of mourning, because this is what has been shaped our reality. This is what has shaped our world, and as we give up having to be right, we mourn. There's a loss. It's like, okay, now what do I do if I don't have this particular belief or attitude or to guide me? Then where am I? And blessed are the mourn, for they shall be comforted. Because as we release, as we let go, we open up to that presence of God, that God is guiding us. We shall be comforted by the presence of God. And this all continues to flow into the third one, as we'll see, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. And we're not talking about, Casper Milquetoast, the guy that is totally, doesn't speak up for himself, or hides in the back. We're not talking about that as far as what meek means. But we're not talking about in relationship to other people. It's very similar to the poor in spirit, although the poor in spirit has more to do with our relationship with other people and ideas, whereas to be meek is to place God first, to see our own lack of self-importance, that there is a greater reality that we call God, and that we're not it, and to come into tune with that, to be non-resistant to our good. That's my the phrase I like to throw out here for being meek is being non-resistant. Being non-resistant. Emmett Fox is our primary textbook for this particular class. I do have citations of the pages that cover it, not only in the Sermon on the Mount, but Discover the Power Within You by Eric Butterworth, Prayers to the Cosmos by Neil Douglas Klotz, and then I'm also looking at the 8 Limbs of Raja Yoga. I have a Hindu and Buddhist background. Christianity is my primary teaching. The Bible is my primary textbook, but I look at all spiritual traditions and see how they correlate, because there's a definite theme that goes through, such as the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's common within all of the spiritual traditions, a similar kind of statement to that. Emmett Fox, in his book, goes on to, talks about how most people think of being meek. And he says, now either Jesus meant what he said or he did not. Either he knew what he was talking about or he didn't. Most people would think, well, being meek, that somehow that this is nonsense. If we think most, I think we were talking earlier about political and religious people not following their teachings, not doing what they're saying they're going to do. And either Jesus was saying what he really believed or he didn't. And most people who follow the so-called Christian path don't look at everything he said and don't really follow his teachings. I would say everybody here, we don't always We're not always meek. We're not always mournful. We're not always poor in spirit. We're not always seeking the highest and best. We're often caught up in our own. We're not always. But either Jesus said what he meant, or he didn't. Otherwise he was talking nonsense, and there's no reason to follow what he said. But if he is to be relied upon, he goes on to say, then let us pay him the compliment of assuming that he meant what he said and that he knew best about the art of living. The fact is that when correctly understood, the teaching of Jesus is found to be not only true, but exceedingly practicable. I think I said that. I keep wanting to say practicable, but I think it's practicable. Practicable, right? Truly exceedingly practicable. Indeed, it is the most practicable of all doctrines. And that's what unity prides itself in being in New Thought. We talk about being practical Christianity, that we have to put this into practice. Either this is something that we can live by and work through every day, or it doesn't really have any great meaning for us. That this is practical Christianity. We look at the teachings of Jesus and of other spiritual traditions and how we can use those to be better people today. We don't worry about before birth or after death. We're only more considered in the now moment. We'll get back to that here with when I talk about Eric Butterworth a little bit. He goes on to talk about the earth. Okay, so he talks about the earth first. He says, in other words, your earth means the whole of your outer experience, and to inherit the earth means to have dominion over the outer experience. So blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. So to inherit, if we're meek, then we shall have dominion over our outer experience. Towards the earth is our current level of experience. It's like in book of Revelation when we talk about heaven, there'll be a new heaven and a new earth. So heaven is we talk about being the presence, conscious presence of the power of God. We often think in terms of heaven and earth relative to the heaven being our potential, the possibility that we see for experiencing that presence of God, and the earth is our current expression of that. So the earth is where we are now, and heaven is where we see that we can get. And so when we achieve that heaven, that becomes our new earth, and we become aware of a new level or layer of existence that we'd call our new heaven. So that's the new heaven and the new earth. So the earth is our current level of experience. So to inherit the earth means to have dominion over that outer experience. And it goes on to talk about the meek. He says the true significance of the word meek in the Bible is a mental attitude for which there is no other single word. I'm realizing I plugged this in the wrong one. Okay. No other single word available. It is this mental attitude which is the secret of prosperity or success in prayer. So he's talking about the meek as being a mental attitude. It's not the outer action, so to speak. I think I mentioned poor in pride has to do with other people. To be meek has to do with our relationship with God. It says it is a combination of open-mindedness, faith in God, and the realization that the will of God is always something joyous and interesting and vital and much better than anything we could think of for ourselves. That's the quote that I have on the worksheet here. That it is a combination of open-mindedness, faith in God, and the realization that the will of God for us is always something joyous and interesting and vital and much better than anything we could think of for ourselves. He goes on to say that meekness compels God himself, that it's an Oriental saying. Meekness compels God himself. So to be meek is to place ourselves as subservient to God. So when we place ourselves subservient to God, then everything else is subservient to us. In Discover the Power Within You, Eric Butterworth, longtime Unity minister, talking about this. Blessed are the meek. he says that talking about Jesus, he said that the miracle working power that was now his came not to him but through him. So Jesus continued to talk about God working through him. He made a very definite separation between himself and God. Jesus knew that he was not God. He said that I'm not the Father, but I shall be going to the Father, and that the Father does his works in me and through me. So he was very clear that it was not him himself who was doing the work, but that God was doing the works through him. He goes on to talk about the meekness is a sensitiveness or surrender of consciousness to the influence of something. So it's a surrender of consciousness to the influence of something else, being God in this case. When Jesus said, "Blessed are the meek," he doesn't mean a surrender to people, but to God. So we're talking about our relationship to God. The best conductor of electricity is the substance that is least resistant to the flow of electric current. Likewise, the best conductor of divine power is the person who is non-resistant to the flow of divine power. This attitude comes from a conviction that God is always the answer to human needs, and a willingness to submit wholeheartedly to the flow of the Spirit in and through us. So it's a non-resistance to the flow of divine power. So that's what he's meaning by the term meek. It's a little different way of looking at the same thing. Being non-resistant to the flow of divine power. So allowing God to work through us. So when we allow God to work through us, then we shall have dominion over our outer level of expression, or over the earth. We shall inherit the earth, or have dominion over that part. And then I quoted he takes the Beatitude and he restates it. And in this case he says, "I am in tune with God. That which is God-inspired and God-directed shall prevail." I am in tune with God. So he talks about, he changes that "blessed are the meek" to say, "I am in tune with God." So being meek is being in tune with God. It's kind of, sometimes I think of our minds as not just, not creators of thought, but that we are transmitters of thought, receivers and transmitters of thought. That thoughts not so much are generated within our minds, but that we receive them, and we either hang on to them, or and transmit them, or we let them go. And that we can tune in to different levels of thought. We can tune into the negativity, we can tune into sickness, we can tune into conflict, we can tune into, there are different channels, poverty, discord, all those things that we can tune into. And if we tune into those channels, that's what we see. And what we're talking about here is to tune into the God channel, which sees the possibilities, the potential for creation, the potential for prosperity and abundance, the potential for peace and harmony, the potential for health and wholeness, the potential for divine guidance and inspiration, the divine order and divine timing are established. That's the God channel that we're tuning into, to be in tune with the infinite. That was a whole other book out there called "To Be in Tune with the Infinite," and Eric Butterworth uses that. Tunes in to that particular phrase, "I am in tune with God." Now, Neil Douglas Klotz is an Aramaic scholar who took the Aramaic version of the Gospels and interpreted. Because one thing we know is the ancient languages had a lot fewer words. I mean, we got about 70,000 last I saw, maybe more, 100,000 maybe now, of different words in the English language, yet in the ancient Chaldean and Hebrew, there's only like 4,000 or 5,000. And so one thing we know of is like sometimes letters would be a word, like "ah," basically means God. And then you add Allah, add another phrase, and that brings a little different, or Elohim, El-ah or El, are basically the same thing with a little different between Aramaic and Chaldean. Arabic and Chaldean? Anyway, and Hebrew. Arabic and Hebrew, that's what I'm thinking. So, it's like Yahweh So if every letter is a word, then often a word is a sentence or a paragraph. So like Yahweh, which is one of the names for God, Jehovah in the German, we hear, and it's in the Hebrew it's YHWH. So we didn't use vowels. So Yahweh is how it would be pronounced, and literally it means I am that I am. We see that in the book of Exodus. When Moses asked God, what is your name? And he says, my name is I am. Tell them that I am has sent you. I am that I am, or I will be what I will be, or I am what I will to be. There's a whole slew of ways of, because there's no tenses. It's all in the present tense. So we have to assume the tense, whether it's past or future tense, based on the context of what is being said. So the words can be interpreted in several different ways. And he talks about blessed are the meek, and he uses some different phrases. Blessed are the gentle. Healthy are those who have softened what is rigid within. Aligned with the one are the humble, those submitted to God's will. Healed are those who have wept inwardly with the pain of repressed desire. Integrated, resisting corruption, are those who have dissolved heavy morality within. So blessed are the meek. Just to say that means meek as we normally understand it is fairly egotistical. How we've taken one of the things, the problems with most Bible interpretation and preaching is that most preachers think that God wrote this all at one time, and it was written in English. And really the whole thing was written by many different. That's why we have different versions of the same events. We just went through Easter. The Gospel of John, we have Mary coming to the tomb. In the Gospel of Matthew, we have Mary and Mother Mary. We have two women coming to the tomb. In the Gospel of Luke, we have Mary, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of Jesus, and the other Mary. So three women coming to the tomb. How many women came to the tomb? Well, each gospel writer had their different understandings of what happened. So does that mean that one was right and one was wrong? Well, no. It's for us to look at. In unity, it's not history in the Western sense. I alluded to that earlier, but in the Eastern sense. In other words, it's the greater reality, not the physical reality that's being talked about. That doesn't mean the events didn't happen, but the way in which they are talked about has a spiritual significance beyond the actual physical event that we can draw from. So each one, I'm not going to go into those individual stories of why one says it did. That was last week on Easter Sunday that we talked about that. So integrated, resisting corruption are those who have dissolved heavy morality within. They shall be open to receive the splendor of earth's fruits. That's the version that I put in our notes here. Integrated. I love that word, integrated. When I think of being integrated, I think in terms of our thoughts and our words and our actions all being aligned. That when we are truly integrated. And integral. So when we are being in integrity or integral within ourselves, that means that everything is aligned, integrated. That means that our thoughts and our feelings and our actions are all in alignment. And how many, we have a lot of different thoughts, but then what we say isn't necessarily what we're thinking. That's what we talked about politics earlier, and that's what we see in politicians all the time. Is we don't really know what's going on by what they say. What they say is not, and then we can see what they do and realize that those are the two obvious ones, what people say and what they do. And what they do is reflective of what they're thinking. But what they say isn't in alignment with what they do, we know they are totally out of integrity. Integral. And we see that with ourselves often, because sometimes we say, with all honesty and sincerity, that this is what we're going to do, And then we find ourselves not being able to do it for one reason or another, or it takes a while before we get around to it. I know most of us would say, oh yeah, I always do what I say I'm going to do. Well, reality is possibly a little different.
What a liar I am here. I have a stepson here, and my wife is an enabler, and I let her do it here, and and hey, the way I think and feel about such things are are totally opposite here. Hey, he made his own bed, let him live in it. And,
right.
But I go right along with her here. Everybody needs a little support, so I don't know where I stand, but it's like I said, just living in a the way you feel one way about it.
It's a hard thing. It's hard to to live what we really believe, because there's so many different demands upon our time and our actions and what we're going to do, and so living in total integrity is very difficult in modern life, and takes a lot of concentrated effort, and that's what we're being called to do, is to focus ourselves on being meek, putting God first. That means family second, then comes work and everything else after. For me, that's my priority: God first, family second, and everything else kind of falls in place. I tend to disappoint people I work with and for sometimes, because I'm not always, because God and family are calling me to do something else and I'm not able to get to. So being clear on the priorities. So we talked about how the rest of the sermon correlates or expands upon the Beattitudes. So blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. We start with Matthew chapter 6, verses 19, and it goes on through 34. And it starts with, do not lay up for yourself treasures on earth, where moth and rust consume, and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourself treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust consumes, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. And again, that's about setting priorities. God first. My relationship with God is the most important thing to me in my life. So maintaining, God first. That's where my treasure is. Where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. So in other words, if it's treasure on earth, if it's our bank account, if putting our bank account first, or putting our health first, or putting a relationship first, and everything else comes second, then those are always going to be changing. There's always going to be problems. There's always going to be conflicts. But if we put God first, then the rest of it just falls in place. I believe in divine order and divine timing. I have my beliefs. I have my, desires. I know who I wanted for president. I know who I want, how I want things to happen. I know, the bills that I want to see passed, or, what I want the governor to do, or, the mayor to do, or, the church elder to do, or the priest to do, or whatever. And I have to put God first and believe in divine order and divine timing. That things are happening for a purpose. I may not be able to see what that purpose is. And if I resist it, if I resist what's going on, then I'm going to be bumped and hit, and be depressed and anxious and go through all these kinds of things. How's it going? Mm-hmm. Have you met Tom? Tom? Brent? No. Brent, right? Mm-hmm. Brent? Tom, Brent. Welcome.
Whoa.
Yeah. So if I'm resisting divine order and divine timing and getting angry and mad and all those sorts of things, I'm going to be bumping my head against and getting hurt and all those things. So I have to be non-resistant if I really want to truly live a fulfilling, content life. If I really want to be as productive as I'm going to be, I can't let all this other stuff get in my way. So non-resistance comes in here with the idea of not laying up ourselves treasures on earth, for where our treasure is, there will our heart be also. Then he goes on to talk about the eye is the lamp of the body. If your eye is sound, and I make a note here in King James Version, it's single. If your eye is single, your whole body would be full of light. If your eye is sound. But if your eye is not sound, your whole body would be full of darkness. If then the light in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? So the eye of the lamp of the body, your eye has to be sound. So in other words, we're not talking about the physical eye, the outer eye, but the inner eye, our inner sense of seeing. What are we looking for? What are we keeping our eyes open for? What is our heart? You think of our heart or our sense of being, and keeping that single, right? Or eye is sound or single. I like that King James Version of being single. Single, divine order and divine timing. God first. This whole concept we've been talking about being meek, is putting God first. And it goes on to talk about no one can serve two masters. You cannot serve God and mammon. And then, therefore, I do not be anxious about your life, what you shall eat or what you shall drink, nor about your body, what you shall put on, etc., etc. He talks about the birds of the air and the grass of the fields and how they're adorned and taken care of, etc., etc. And he gets down here to verse 33. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things shall be yours as well. Now we talked about being meek, about letting God be God, and I'll be me, and let God be God. And when I let God be God, and be God in me, working in and through me, then I inherit the earth, and then I have some dominion over what is going on around me in my world. I have dominion. I have some level of control and influence. But if I think I'm in control, then I lose control, right? Because God will often have other ideas. Divine order is often not my order. God's will be done, not my will be done. If I always have to have my will, then it's going to come in conflict with God's will sometimes, and guess what? Guess who wins? Therefore, do not be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will be anxious for itself. Let the day's own trouble be sufficient for the day. One day at a time, right? Live for today. Be open. Live for today. Learn from yesterday, right? Plan for tomorrow, but live in today. And what they often say, yesterday is history, tomorrow is mystery. The gift is in the moment, and that's why they call it the present. So this is all about living one day at a time and being in the now moment and conscious of that presence of God. Now that's where we started, right? Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. That's a conscious awareness of the presence of God. Then we had to go through some mourning because we had to let go of our precious belief and ideas. And when we do, then we are fully let go, then we are comforted in the knowledge that God is in charge. And then we're able to live in this meekness, in this awareness of the presence of God, that there is a God and I'm not it, and allow God to be God in me. And in that attitude, in that consciousness, then we inherit the earth. We have dominion over this outer experience. That doesn't mean I can control everything in the physical realm, but I do have control over my experience. That doesn't mean everything goes my way. That just means that I have a conscious awareness of the divine order and divine timing that is active, even though it doesn't go my way, right? Whether or not, when things, because quite often things don't go my way. I've figured that out along the way. So do not, let the day's own trouble be sufficient for the day, to live for today. Then Eric Butterworth talking about this. Emmett Fox in his book, The Sermon on the Mount, talking about treasure in heaven, he talks about how the material plane is only objective thought. We should realize the folly of collecting or trying to collect large sums of money. It says, if your consciousness is right, that is, if you have a good understanding of God as the loving source of your boundless supply, you will always be able to demonstrate whatever money or goods you may require. That if our consciousness is right, if we're right with God, then we will always demonstrate, we will always manifest, we will always experience a boundless supply and always able to demonstrate whatever money or goods you may require. And I love that, require, right? And, one of my favorite affirmations is, with God as my source, all I need and require is readily provided. I didn't say what I want, right? I may want $1 million and a big house and a fancy sports car, etc., etc., etc. But all that I need and require is readily provided. So there's no reason to be anxious. There's no reason to be worried when I live in a conscious awareness of divine order and divine timing, that God's in charge.
What scripture passage is he referring to there?
He's talking about what we were just talking about here, Matthew 6:19 through 34, which talks about the Beatitude, Matthew 5:5, and it's the treasure. Do not lay treasures up on earth, for where your treasure is, your heart will be also. Do not be anxious for your life. Seek his kingdom first, which really relates to being meek. If a reasonable part of time and attention that most people spend in the pursuit of material goods were devoted by them to scientific prayer and meditation, the change in consciousness which would follow would put them beyond any possibility of suffering for any of those hazards. And he's talking about, feeling that you can't, the banks fail, stock market crashes, mines and wells give out, inventions don't, railroad stations, enterprises, real estate crashes, all that stuff that could happen. It doesn't really matter when we are aware of that presence and the power of God. That what is lost will be, even if we lose value, commensurate value will be returned elsewhere. So as long as we are non-resistant to our good. And that means to what happens. It doesn't mean everything's going to happen that we would like it to happen. But when we're non-resistant to that, then the good will flow in. But if we're resistant, then we are blocking the flow of good. So if we're resistant to what is happening, then we're blocking the flow. And we have to be part of the flow. That's being affluent. Do you want to be affluent? That literally means to be a channel for the flow of water. To be an affluent is to be a channel for the flow of water. It's a channel for water to go, that feeds into a larger water source. So an affluent. So to be affluent is to be a channel for God's good. There's so much good stuff in here, but I'm going to move on to I like to talk about the 8 limbs of Raja Yoga, which, we have 8 Beattitudes, and we have 8 limbs of Raja Yoga in the Buddha's Eightfold Path, which correlate. They're not saying they're the same thing necessarily. They're not exactly the same teaching. They're from a different culture, but they have correlation. And the 8 limbs of Raja Yoga, the third limb is asana, which is the posture, and in how to let God and how to know God. All that really matters is to take up a position in which one can sit absolutely still and erect, holding the chest, neck, and head in a straight line, but without strain, so that one can forget the body altogether. So that's the purpose of what we normally think of as yoga, which is the exercises, the postures, the asanas. That's only one limb of Raja Yoga. And the whole purpose of that is to get the body out of the way, get the mind and the body out of the way so that we can be open up to consciousness of spirit. Now, does that sound like meekness? I think it does to me. Mm-hmm. Right? So that's what the asanas are all about, is to get the body and the mind out of the way so that we can be open to the awareness of God. Now, the first asana, or the first limb was yama, which means to stop doing what you're not supposed to do. And the second was niyama, which means to start doing what you're supposed to do, which, relates pretty well. It's, when we talked earlier about being poor in spirit and mourning, because we have to give up what we used to do in order to do what we should be doing. And this one is, got to do with opening up, getting our mind and body out of the way so that we can experience that presence of God, to get... and he talks about the lotus posture and things like that. Then the Eightfold Path, there are 8 path factors. We started with right understanding, right thinking, and this time it's right speech. And in this book, Buddha's Path, Nina Gorkin talks about there are 3 path factors, which are the factors of good moral conduct. So we had the first 2. And the next 3, right speech, right action, and right livelihood, they have the function of abstaining from wrong speech, wrong action, and wrong livelihood. She doesn't go into a whole lot in this book on those particular ones, but if you look at the Sermon at Benares, which is when Buddha first came out, he had his enlightenment, and then he he kind of went into seclusion, and then he came out at Benares, and he gave his first speech, and that's where he lays out the middle path. That's kind of the main concept of Buddhism, because he had been born a prince, and he had experienced the excesses of opulence as a prince. And then when he saw people who were dying and sick and living in poverty, he took on the aesthetic life. So he went into the excesses of the aesthetic, the denial, the self-flagellation, eating, minimum of eating, etc., etc. And then he has his enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, and he comes out and he says that he talks about the middle of path, which is to avoid those 2 extremes. So it's not about opulence, it's not about abstention. It's about having the middle path, which leads to peace of mind, higher wisdom, to full enlightenment, to nirvana. So he talks about the middle path. He mentions the 4 noble truths, but he also talks about where was it? It's in here somewhere. The extremes, middle path leads to peace of mind. And he also talks about the 8 limbs, right views, which is the right understanding, right aspiration. So he says, right views will be the torch to light his way, right aspirations will be his guide, right speech will be his dwelling place on the road. So the understandings are the torch to light our way. The thinking will be our guide, and our speech will be our dwelling place on the road. Our speech will be the dwelling place on the road. That's where to dwell is, where we live, where we come from. It can relate to meekness. I can see the relationship with meekness, that we dwell in a conscious awareness of God's presence, that we are living in divine order and divine timing, that God's in charge. That's our dwelling place on the road. And right speech is, I mentioned earlier, the integrity of our thoughts and our feeling, our thoughts and our words and our actions all being in alignment. So the right speech is that which aligns our thinking and our actions. It's that integrity that we see. So these are the Eightfold Path, 8 limbs of Raja Yoga, the Beatitude, and the Sermon on the Mount about being non-resistant, in tune, and receptive to our good. Any questions, comments, concerns?